At my son's wedding, his bride pushed my wife into the mud in front of 300 guests. My son put his arm around her and whispered something that made her laugh. I simply walked to the microphone and said something no one in that room was expecting. Her own father set down his champagne glass. The band stopped playing. Welcome to Silent Sweet Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, take a moment and subscribe. That way the next story finds its way to you without you having to go looking for it. Before we get into things, I'd love to know, what does the weather look like where you are right now? There's something about a quiet, overcast day that makes a story like this one land a little differently. One quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it, and there is plenty of that here. My name is Gordon Whitley, and I'm 67 years old. The afternoon air hung heavy with humidity and the scent of high-end catering. The Drumfield estate stretched out in every direction, a grand, sprawling backdrop, perfectly suited to the illusion of wealth that my new daughter-in-law Tiffany had insisted upon for her wedding day. A brief summer storm had just rolled through, leaving the stone patio slick underfoot and the manicured lawns soft with mud. Evelyn, my wife of 40 years, was making her way through the crowd of laughing, drinking guests. She looked beautiful in her modest navy dress, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres toward Cody, our son, who was holding court near the patio's edge with Tiffany. The jazz trio was playing a gentle melody. Everything looked flawless until Evelyn stepped slightly backward to let a waiter pass. The heel of her shoe caught the very edge of Tiffany's extravagant, custom-designed train. It was an accident, a simple and entirely harmless misstep. Evelyn spun around immediately, her face pale, hand outstretched to steady herself and offer her apology. Tiffany did not accept it. Instead, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, she shoved my wife hard. Evelyn lost her footing on the slick stone, stumbled backward off the patio's edge, and crashed directly into the thick, dark mud below. The sound of her hitting the ground cut through every conversation on that patio. A collective gasp swept through the crowd of 300 people. I froze my coffee cup, stopped halfway to my mouth. I waited for my son, the boy we had raised with every ounce of our love and resources, to rush forward. I waited for Cody to pull his mother up, to turn on his new bride for laying hands on a 65-year-old woman. Instead, Cody looked down at his mother sitting in the mud, wrapped his arm around Tiffany's waist, leaned close to her ear, and chuckled. He actually laughed. The blood pounding in my ears swallowed the jazz trio whole. I did not yell. I did not make a physical scene. I set my cup down on a passing waiter's tray and walked through the crowd as it parted around me. People stepped aside, their eyes moving back and forth between me and the muddy ruin of my wife's navy dress. I knelt beside Evelyn. Her eyes were brimming with tears of profound humiliation. Her dress was soaked through with brown sludge, ruined. I drew the handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped the mud from her cheek. I helped her to her feet, kissed her forehead, and whispered for her to go wait by the car. Then I turned and directed my attention toward the stage. I moved with a slow, deliberate stride. Tiffany was already busy inspecting the hem of her pristine white gown, complaining loudly to her bridesmaids about the smudge my wife had supposedly left behind. Cody stood nearby, still grinning, a glass of champagne in hand. I climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The band leader, reading whatever was on my face, stopped conducting mid-bar. The music died on the spot. I reached over and lifted the microphone from its stand. The feedback whined sharply, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. 300 faces turned my way. Clifton Drumfield, Tiffany's father, was positioned near the front, his arrogant chest broad and proud inside his tailored tuxedo. He lowered his champagne flute, a frown pulling at his forehead. I looked directly at Cody, my son, the boy I had shielded and provided for every day of his life. "Cody!" I said, my voice carrying off the stone walls of the estate. "Your mother sends her apologies for dirtying the bride's dress. To make up for the inconvenience, I'm announcing my wedding gift right now." Cody puffed out his chest, a smug smile sliding across his face. He nudged Tiffany, bracing himself for a grand gesture, some display of wealth to rival the drum fields. I reached into my breast pocket and produced the crisp white envelope holding the cashier's check I had prepared that very morning. A check for $150,000, the down payment on their dream home. I held the envelope up where the entire crowd could see it. "This envelope," I continued, my voice perfectly level, "contains a check for $150,000. It was meant to start your new life. However, seeing as that new life involves putting hands on the woman who gave you life, I am officially canceling this check, effective immediately." I tore the envelope in half right there at the microphone. The sound of it tearing came through the speakers loud and final. Then I tore it again. I let the pieces drift down like snow onto the polished wooden stage. The silence that fell over that reception was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Clifton Drumfield's mouth hung slightly open. Several bridesmaids raised their hands to cover their own. I turned and moved to walk away. I was finished. The line had been crossed, and I was severing the financial cord for good. But Cody did not stand there in shame. He did not come after me to apologize. Instead, he stormed up onto the stage, face flushed crimson with fury. He snatched the microphone out of my hand, the feedback screeching again. He fixed me with a sneer, his eyes loaded with venom. "Keep your penny-pinching money, old man," he spat, his voice booming through the speakers. "You think I need your pathetic little savings? Clifton is making me a full partner at Drumfield Imports on Monday. I'm stepping into the big leagues. We don't need you or your miserable money anymore. Go home." A smattering of uncomfortable applause rose from the Drumfield side of the room. Cody wrapped his arm triumphantly around Tiffany. I did not respond. I simply stepped down from the stage and walked out of the reception through the parking lot to where my wife was waiting. But as I walked, my mind was moving fast. Cody's arrogant declaration was still echoing in my head. Clifton is making me a full partner. My son believed he had just won. He thought he had humiliated me in front of everyone. But there was a catastrophic flaw buried inside his triumphant announcement. Cody believed I was nothing more than a mid-level supply chain manager who pinched pennies. He believed Clifton Drumfield was a titan of industry. What Cody did not know, and what Clifton Drumfield was desperately working to conceal, was that Drumfield Imports had been secretly bankrupt for 3 years. The company was drowning in toxic debt. Clifton didn't have 2 dimes to rub together, let alone the capital to hand a 32-year-old kid a full partnership. Partnerships inside corporate structures like that demand a massive buy-in, millions of dollars. So as I turned the key in my 12-year-old sedan and prepared to drive my muddy, weeping wife home, a cold question settled deep in my gut. If Drumfield Imports was bankrupt and my son had no money of his own, how exactly had Cody bought his way in? What had he traded for that partnership? The answer I was about to uncover would send my own son to federal prison. The drive back to our neighborhood was completely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic beat of the windshield wipers pushing away the summer rain. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in my suit jacket, shivering. The mud had dried into an ugly crust on her skin, and her beautiful navy dress was ruined beyond saving. She stared out the window and refused to look at me. I knew she was crying quietly. The betrayal of our own son laughing while his wife shoved her into the dirt was a wound no bandage could reach. I kept both hands locked on the steering wheel of my 12-year-old sedan. I did not speed. I did not drive erratically. I kept my focus on the road because if I let my mind settle on the image of Cody chuckling at his mother, I would have turned the car around and done something I could never take back. We pulled into the driveway of our modest 4-bedroom suburban home, the same house Cody grew up in, the same house where we'd celebrated his birthdays and sat beside him over homework. I walked Evelyn inside and brought her straight to the master bathroom. I ran warm water and helped her rinse the mud out of her hair. She did not say a single word. She simply wept. Once she was clean and dressed in her softest flannel pajamas, I tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and promised her that everything was going to be all right. I waited until her breathing slowed and exhaustion pulled her down into deep sleep. Then I walked down the hall to my home office. I closed the heavy walnut door and locked it. I sat at my desk and reached for my secure phone. I dialed a number I kept only in my memory. It rang exactly twice before a sharp professional voice picked up. It was Harlan, my lead corporate attorney, and the man who managed all of my sensitive legal affairs. I skipped the pleasantries entirely. I told Harlan to wake up his best forensic accountants. I needed a complete, silent, expedited audit of every financial move my son had made across the last 6 months. I also needed a thorough background check on Clifton Drumfield and his import operation. Harlan asked if there was a specific problem. I told him my son had just claimed to have purchased a full partnership in a bankrupt company, and I needed to know exactly whose money he used to do it. You see, Cody had spent his entire life believing a very particular story about his father. He thought I was nothing more than a mid-level supply chain manager who pinched pennies and led a quiet, unremarkable existence. He looked down on our modest house. He rolled his eyes at my 12-year-old car. He thought I was small. He thought I had no ambition. He constantly held up Clifton Drumfield as the standard, a man who drove imported sports cars and wore custom-tailored suits. But Cody never grasped how genuine wealth actually operates. Real wealth does not announce itself. Real wealth stays quiet. The truth I had kept concealed to stop my son from becoming a spoiled, entitled brat was that I never worked in the supply chain department. I owned the entire supply chain. I am the sole owner of a large holding company that controls commercial real estate across the entire region. Those warehouses Clifton Drumfield leases for his import business sit on land that belongs to me. The shopping centers where Tiffany buys her designer clothes are inside my corporate portfolio. I have spent decades constructing a quiet, invisible empire. I kept my lifestyle modest because I wanted Cody to understand the value of hard work. I wanted him to build his own success rather than wait around for an inheritance. But the plan misfired. My restraint did not cultivate humility in him. It made him resentful, and it left him wide open to the shiny illusions people like the Drumfields sold so well. I sat in the dark for hours, eyes fixed on the glowing screen of my computer. I watched the rain hammer against the office window. I turned over every recent interaction with Cody, searching for the missing piece. Partnerships at the corporate level are not sealed with a handshake. They demand enormous capital, millions of dollars in liquid assets or hard collateral. Cody drew a decent salary, but he was buried in credit card debt, trying to keep pace with Tiffany and her extravagant tastes. He did not have the cash. He did not have the credit. So how had he purchased his way into Clifton Drumfield's company? What leverage could a 32-year-old possibly offer a desperate, failing businessman? The clock on my desk read 2 a.m. when my secure phone finally buzzed. The bright screen sliced through the darkness. I picked up immediately. Harlan sounded breathless on the other end of the line. He told me I needed to sit down. I told him I was already sitting and pushed him to tell me what his team had found. Harlan explained that Cody had not used cash to buy his partnership. He used paper. My blood ran cold as Harlan began to lay out the timeline. He told me to think back to exactly 5 weeks ago. 5 weeks ago, Evelyn was admitted to the local hospital for a minor gallbladder surgery. It was a routine procedure, but she was placed on heavy pain medication for several days to manage the discomfort. I remained by her side for nearly the entire stay, but there was one afternoon where I had to step out to meet with a local property manager. I was gone for exactly 2 hours. Cody had volunteered to sit with his mother while I was away. Harlan's voice turned grim. He explained that during those 2 hours, while Evelyn was heavily medicated and completely vulnerable, Cody brought a notary into her hospital room. Cody presented his mother with a stack of legal documents. He told Evelyn they were standard medical proxy forms required by the hospital administration. He smiled, held her hand, and assured her she did not need to read the fine print because her eyes were blurry from the medication. He simply pointed to the dotted lines and told her where to sign. Evelyn trusted her son. She signed every single page he placed in front of her. She probably looked up at him with a grateful smile, thanking him for handling the tedious paperwork so his father wouldn't have to worry. The image of my wife gazing up at him with drug-hazed affection while he calmly handed her the instrument of our ruin turned my stomach. But those were not medical proxy forms. Harlan revealed the devastating truth. Cody had tricked his mother into signing a broad, durable power of attorney. That document handed Cody absolute and unchecked legal control over Evelyn's financial assets and property rights. My chest tightened so severely I could barely draw breath. My own son had preyed on his mother while she lay in a hospital bed recovering from surgery. I asked Harlan what Cody had done with that document. The answer was a masterclass in betrayal. Harlan told me that Cody took that fraudulent power of attorney directly to Clifton Drumfield. Cody used it to sign over the deed to our pristine summer estate, the beautiful lakefront property Evelyn and I had purchased 30 years ago, the place where we spent every July watching the sun sink over the water, the place where Cody learned to fish, standing on the wooden dock I had built with my own 2 hands. Cody had legally transferred the deed of that property to Clifton Drumfield to serve as hard collateral for a massive corporate loan. That was his buy-in. That was how he secured his gleaming new partnership. He used our memories and our refuge to purchase a hollow title from a hollow tycoon. I ended the call with Harlan and set the phone gently on my desk. The silence of the house pressed down like something physical. I looked down the hallway toward the master bedroom where my wife lay sleeping, with no idea that her son had stolen her property while holding her hand in a hospital bed. She was already shattered from being shoved into the mud. If she discovered the full scope of his deception, it would finish her completely. Cody thought he had won. He believed his forged paperwork and his arrogant new family had lifted him clear above his dull, frugal parents. He thought he was untouchable because he had decided I was just a worn-out old man who lacked the means to fight back. He did not realize he had just kicked a sleeping giant. He wanted to play high-stakes corporate games using my assets. He wanted to pull the ground out from under us. I opened my encrypted corporate ledger and stared at the sprawling web of companies under my control. Come morning, I would no longer be the quiet supply chain manager. I was going to show Cody and his new father-in-law what real power looks like. And I was going to ensure they walked away with absolutely nothing. I did not hurl my coffee mug against the wall. I did not shout into the empty hallway. Anger is a cheap emotion. It makes you careless. It makes you loud. And what I needed right now was to be entirely silent. I settled back into the heavy leather chair of my home office, wrapped in complete darkness, except for the cold blue glow of my computer monitors. The rain continued to lash the glass, but my mind had fully detached from the storm outside. I was locked entirely on the digital trail my son had left behind. Cody believed he was a mastermind, running a sophisticated corporate play. But the footprint he had left behind was so wide and reckless, it was nearly an insult to examine. I opened my encrypted master ledger. I moved through 3 separate security firewalls to reach the core banking portal of my holding company. I tapped into the county registry database. It was time to map exactly how deep my son had dug his own grave. The Summer estate was the first piece of the puzzle. I pulled up the public property records. There it was, a title transfer executed exactly 2 weeks ago. The forged power of attorney had been scanned and attached to the file. I stared at the digital copy of my wife's signature. The handwriting was unsteady, shaped by the heavy painkillers coursing through her veins during her hospital stay. My chest tightened again, but I forced the feeling down. I had to stay clinical. I had to look at this not as a wounded father, but as the chief executive of an empire under assault. Cody had transferred the property to a newly formed corporate entity. I ran a quick search on that registry. It was registered to Clifton Drumfield. Cody had literally handed over a multi-million-dollar lakefront property for absolutely zero financial compensation. It was a blind, desperate offering made to earn the approval of his arrogant new father-in-law. But as I pushed deeper into the commercial registry, I spotted a secondary filing attached to the same corporate profile. My eyes narrowed. You do not file that specific addendum unless you are leveraging the asset. I cross-referenced the company against the commercial loan databases my holding company monitors. A new entry appeared on the screen, and the numbers hit me like a fist to the gut. Cody had not simply handed over the deed to the summer house. He had used that forged power of attorney to originate a massive commercial loan. Clifton Drumfield had secured $500,000 in liquid cash to pump directly into his failing import business. Cody was the primary signatory on the loan application. He had used his mother's stolen legal authority to underwrite Clifton's bailout. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. But it was the collateral schedule attached to the bottom of the loan agreement that turned my blood to ice. A $500,000 commercial line of credit demands serious backing. The summer house alone was not sufficient to satisfy the aggressive terms of the bank Clifton had chosen. I scrolled down to the secondary collateral section, my vision blurring for just a fraction of a second. There, laid out in plain black and white, was the address of my primary residence, the house I was sitting in at that very moment, the house where my wife was sleeping down the hall. Cody had cross-collateralized our family home to secure the remaining funds for Clifton. He had placed a lien on the roof over his mother's head to buy his way into a counterfeit partnership. If Clifton Drumfield defaulted on this high-interest loan, the bank would not simply seize the summer estate. They would foreclose on the house we had lived in for 30 years. My son had legally authorized a bank to put his parents out on the street the moment his new father-in-law missed a payment. He had sold our past and our present to purchase his own future. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The betrayal was so total, so architecturally complete, that it almost defied comprehension. He had left us with nothing to stand on. Now I was facing a decision no father should ever be forced to make. I studied the digital copy of the forged power of attorney glowing on the screen. I had the legal and financial resources to dismantle that document with a single phone call. I could reach my attorneys and the banking authorities right now. I could file an immediate fraud injunction. The legal mechanism was remarkably straightforward. The instant I declared the document a forgery, the bank's automated compliance protocols would trigger. The $500,000 loan would be recalled on the spot. Clifton Drumfield's company would be thrown into immediate receivership, and his entire pathetic empire would crumble before sunrise. He would be ruined and bankrupt. But destroying Clifton was the easy part. The real problem lay in the criminal liability. The bank would need a scapegoat for the fraudulent loan origination. The signature on the commercial application did not belong to Clifton. It belonged to Cody. My son was the one who had presented the forged document across state lines to secure the money. He committed wire fraud. He committed grand larceny. He committed severe elder financial abuse against his own mother. These were not civil matters that could be resolved with a fine. These were federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. If I voided that power of attorney tonight, federal authorities would assume jurisdiction by tomorrow afternoon. Cody would be staring down 15 years in a federal penitentiary. 15 years behind bars. His new marriage would unravel. His reputation would be permanently obliterated. His entire life would be finished before his 33rd birthday. I pushed back from my desk and moved to the window. I stood there, watching the rain move across the dark street below. I thought about the small boy who used to climb onto my lap and help me guide the car into the driveway. I thought about the teenager I had stood and applauded at his high school graduation. I thought about the man who just hours ago had stood on a stage and laughed while his new bride shoved his mother into the mud. He had told me to go home. He had told me he was done with my miserable money. He had picked his side. He had chosen greed over loyalty. He had chosen arrogance over respect. If I stayed silent, I would be allowing a thief to strip away my wife's security. I would be enabling a predator. Cody believed I was weak. He believed I would quietly absorb the humiliation because my love for him was too great to allow me to fight back. He was counting on my paternal instinct to shield him from the consequences of what he had done. But a father's role is not to protect a son from the weight of reality. A father's role is to make certain he understands that every action carries a price. Cody had written a check with his arrogance that his reality could never cover. I returned to my desk and stared at the glowing monitors. I did not pick up the phone to call the bank. I did not trigger the immediate fraud alert. I was not going to hand them the mercy of a swift collapse. I was going to let them walk directly into the trap they had constructed for me. I closed the ledger and powered down the computer. The silent audit was finished. It was time to prepare for the eviction. The morning sun drove through the living room blinds with a harsh and unforgiving light. The storm from the day before had fully cleared, leaving the suburban streets outside quiet and washed clean. I am standing in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. I have not closed my eyes once. I spent the entire night in my dark office, tracing the digital fingerprints of my son's enormous betrayal. Down the hallway, the house is completely still. Evelyn is still asleep in the master bedroom. I had made sure she took a mild sedative to help her rest after the deep humiliation she endured at the reception. The navy dress she wore yesterday is now sitting in a black garbage bag by the back door, a ruined, mud-stained remnant of the exact moment I lost my son forever. A sudden, hard knocking breaks through the silence of the house. It is not a polite tap. It is the heavy, entitled pounding of someone who believes they have a claim on the door they are hitting. I set my coffee mug on the granite counter and walk slowly toward the foyer. A small, foolish corner of my father's heart holds out hope that Cody has come to his senses overnight. I want to believe he is standing on the porch, ready to fall to his knees and beg his mother's forgiveness for laughing while his new bride drove her into the dirt. I undo the deadbolt and pull open the heavy wooden door. Cody and Tiffany are standing on my front porch. They do not look like newlyweds waking up on the first morning of their honeymoon. They look like corporate enforcers arriving to collect a debt. Tiffany is wearing a designer athleisure set and oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses that swallow half her face. She is working a piece of gum with a slow, arrogant rhythm, completely indifferent to the wreckage she left behind yesterday. Cody is wearing a tailored blazer over a crisp, casual shirt. He does not look at the ground. He looks me straight in the eye, his posture radiating unearned superiority. He does not ask how his mother is holding up. He does not offer a single syllable of apology for the scene he allowed at the estate. Instead, Tiffany steps forward and drives a thick manila folder into my chest. I have to snap my hands up to catch it before it falls to the porch floor. I open the folder. The official embossed seal of the county court stares back at me. It is a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. The document demands that Gordon and Evelyn Whitley vacate the premises immediately, citing a transfer of ownership deed executed just days prior. I stare at the bold black letters across the top of the page, a cold, clinical demand to abandon my entire life. I look up from the papers. Cody crosses his arms and leans against the brick column of the porch with practiced ease. He speaks to me in a voice so flat and calculated it sends ice through my veins. He tells me the house is no longer mine. He explains that under his new partnership agreement, the property has been fully collateralized under the Drumfield corporate umbrella. He says Clifton Drumfield needs to liquidate this asset immediately to fund their upcoming business ventures and to support the new luxury lifestyle that he and Tiffany require. He speaks about my home of 30 years as though it is a discarded piece of furniture. This is the house where I taught him to ride a bicycle in the driveway. This is the house where his mother stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning, helping him assemble school science projects. Now he calls it a liquid asset. He tells me they are listing the house next week, and that I need to have all our cheap, outdated furniture cleared out before the real estate photographers arrive. He says the neighborhood has started to look a little pathetic anyway, and the property is only worth a quick cash sale. Tiffany reaches into her expensive leather handbag and produces a glossy bifold pamphlet, flicking it toward me. It spins through the air and lands on the entryway table inside the house. I look down at it. It is a brochure for a state-run retirement facility located on the poorest side of the county. The cover features a bleak stock photograph of elderly residents seated in a sterile common room. The place has a well-known reputation for cramped shared quarters, underpaid staff, and the permanent suffocating odor of bleach. Cody gestures toward the pamphlet. He tells me it is the best they could manage on such short notice. He says I should count myself lucky they bothered to find us anywhere to go at all. He sweeps a contemptuous look around my modest foyer and tells me I can use my pathetic supply chain manager pension to cover the monthly fees at the facility. He adds that since Evelyn is already slowing down and embarrassing herself at public events, it is the ideal place to tuck her away so she cannot cause any more awkward accidents. The cruelty in his voice is absolute. He is savoring the act of stripping away his parents' dignity. My heart beats with a slow, steady, and quietly terrifying rhythm. I keep my breathing perfectly controlled. I look at the eviction notice in my hand. I look at the humiliating pamphlet on the table. I look at my son. The boy I shielded from every hardship the world had to offer is standing on my porch, grinning like a predator who has just cornered a helpless target. This was his final test, and he has failed it completely. The boy I loved is gone. In his place stands only a greedy, arrogant stranger. Tiffany smirks and adjusts her sunglasses. She taps Cody on the arm and tells him they need to get moving, because they have a first-class flight to catch for their honeymoon. She says she refuses to waste another breath in this depressing neighborhood and wants to be drinking champagne somewhere over the ocean by noon. I do not shout at them. I do not tear up the eviction notice and throw the pieces in their faces. I do not crumble into tears and plead with my son to reconsider. I do not inform them of the federal wire fraud they committed the moment Cody forged Evelyn's signature on those medical proxy documents. I simply fold the legal paper neatly and slide it back inside the manila folder. I look Cody dead in the eye, my voice perfectly quiet and perfectly level. I tell him I will pack. Cody lets out a loud, triumphant laugh. The sound bounces down the quiet suburban street. He wraps his arm around Tiffany's waist and draws her close. Together they turn and walk down the driveway toward their leased luxury sport utility vehicle, laughing and whispering to each other the whole way down. They believe they have completely broken the old man. They think they have outmaneuvered me, forced me into submission, and seized a valuable piece of an empire. I stand in the doorway and watch them climb into their car. They drive away without a single glance back, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic devastation they have just brought down upon themselves. Cody thinks he is a shrewd businessman executing a hostile corporate takeover. He thinks he just claimed a free and clear asset to impress his arrogant father-in-law. What he does not know is that by asserting legal ownership of this specific property and initiating a formal eviction, he stepped directly onto a massive hidden financial landmine. He just bound himself and the entire Drumfield corporate structure to a trap I constructed 15 years ago. They think they are sending me off to a nursing home. They are walking blindly into their own complete destruction. I did not waste time looking back. I walked into the master bedroom where Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the mattress. She looked impossibly small, holding a single framed photograph of Cody from when he was 10 years old. I gently took the frame from her hands and laid it face down on the nightstand. I told her we only needed to pack 2 suitcases, just the bare essentials, and enough clothes for a few weeks. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes and asked where we were going. She asked if we truly had to move into the grim state-run facility Cody had thrown in our faces. I gave her the first genuine, unhurried smile I had managed in 2 days. I kissed her forehead and told her we were going somewhere far better. We walked out the front door of the house we had called home for 3 decades. I did not lock the deadbolt. Cody owned the house. Now let him worry about the security. I drove us away from those quiet suburban streets and pointed the car toward the glittering skyline of the city. Evelyn sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the familiar neighborhoods dissolve into the distance. When I turned into the private underground parking structure beneath the tallest residential tower in the financial district, she finally looked over at me with deep bewilderment. A valet in a crisp uniform opened her door, immediately addressing me by name with full deference. I guided my wife into a private elevator that required a biometric scan to operate. The polished steel doors opened directly into a sprawling 6,000-square-foot penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. The floors were pristine imported marble, and the kitchen alone was larger than our entire old suburban house. Evelyn let her purse drop to the floor. She asked me whose home this was and what we were doing here. I took her hands in mine and told her the truth I had kept hidden to protect her peace of mind and to safeguard our son's character. I told her the penthouse belonged to a blind trust. I told her the blind trust belonged to me. I brought her to a plush velvet sofa overlooking the city lights and sat beside her. I explained that I had never been a mid-level supply chain manager. Over the last 40 years, I had constructed a major holding company that owned the very commercial buildings visible through the glass. I told her I kept our lives modest because I wanted our son to grow up grounded and understand what a hard-earned dollar actually meant, not to grow up an entitled heir, counting down the days to a massive inheritance. Evelyn listened with wide, still eyes as the full reality of our situation settled over her. The tears of humiliation she had been shedding for 2 days gave way slowly to profound shock. She understood we were not destitute. She understood we were not at the mercy of our arrogant son and his grasping new family. We were entirely untouchable. I poured her a glass of sparkling water and told her to rest. I needed to make a phone call to finalize the transfer of our old property. I walked into the penthouse study, a soundproof room lined with dark wood shelves stacked with legal volumes. I settled into the chair behind the massive glass desk and gazed out over the empire I had quietly assembled from nothing. It was time to spring the trap Cody had so eagerly walked into. 15 years ago, my corporate accountants advised me to structure my personal assets in a way that minimized legal liability. I placed my primary suburban residence under a very specific financial umbrella. I intentionally attached a highly toxic balloon mortgage to the property, using one of my own corporate subsidiaries as the lender. It was a carefully engineered corporate tax shield designed to keep my assets beyond the reach of outside litigation. The terms of this mortgage were utterly predatory. It carried an exorbitant interest rate and a brutal acceleration clause. As long as the deed remained in my name, the mortgage was entirely dormant and harmless. I was effectively borrowing from myself to keep the property untouchable. No payments were ever required because the debt simply sat still inside my own private ledgers. But the acceleration clause had been built around one very specific trigger designed to obliterate anyone who attempted to take the property from me. If the deed was ever transferred, sold, or seized by any outside party without the explicit written consent of the lending company, the full remaining balance of the mortgage became due immediately. Not in 30 days, not in a week, immediately. Cody believed he was being clever when he used the forged medical proxy to transfer the deed of my house to Clifton Drumfield. He thought he was delivering his new father-in-law a clean, unencumbered asset to use as collateral for his struggling import business. He never ran a deep title search. He never retained competent corporate attorneys to vet the property. He was too arrogant, too eager to prove his value to the Drumfield family, to slow down and look carefully at what he was grabbing. By legally claiming ownership of the house through that forged power of attorney, Cody and Clifton had triggered the acceleration clause. They didn't just steal a piece of suburban real estate. They unwittingly took on full legal responsibility for a crushing toxic debt. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Harlan. My lead attorney picked up on the first ring, already anticipating my call. I kept my voice perfectly steady, completely free of any fatherly hesitation. I asked Harlan whether the county clerk had officially processed the deed transfer Cody had submitted. Harlan confirmed that the paperwork had been stamped and finalized an hour ago. Clifton Drumfield was now the legal owner of record for my old suburban house. A cold, hard smile crossed my face in the empty study. I told Harlan to execute the collection protocol on the balloon mortgage. By accepting that deed transfer, Cody and Clifton had just triggered an immediate repayment demand of $2.5 million. The money was owed directly to my holding company, and it was due by close of business the following day. Harlan paused for a fraction of a second on the other end of the line. He noted that Clifton Drumfield did not have $2.5 million in liquid assets. He pointed out that Clifton was already sinking under corporate debt from his failing warehouses and could barely cover his own payroll. I told Harlan that was exactly the point of the trap. When Clifton fails to produce the $2.5 million by tomorrow afternoon, our holding company gains the legal right to seize his business accounts. We freeze his operating capital. We force him into involuntary bankruptcy and dismantle his import operation piece by piece. Harlan understood the assignment perfectly. But before he hung up, he asked me one final, critical question. He reminded me that Cody's name was all over the fraudulent transfer documents. When financial authorities begin investigating this enormous default, they will have no trouble tracing the forged signatures back to my son. Cody will face 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and elder abuse. Harlan asked whether I was absolutely certain I wanted to send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. I gazed out the window at the sprawling city lights below. I thought about Cody laughing in the rain as his mother collapsed into the mud. I told Harlan to initiate the collection process. 4,000 miles away, the tropical sun was blazing down on the crystalline waters of St. Bart's. I knew precisely what the weather looked like over there, because my daughter-in-law was posting every single moment of their lavish honeymoon for all the world to see. I sat behind the massive glass desk in my penthouse study, watching her social media feed refresh in real time on my tablet. Tiffany was uploading videos of herself raising crystal flutes of imported champagne on the deck of an overwater bungalow. She had on designer sunglasses and an enormous sun hat, laughing without a care into the camera. Cody drifted into the frame occasionally, dressed in expensive linen shirts and a silver chronograph he had undoubtedly purchased on credit. They looked like royalty. They looked like a power couple, savoring the rewards of their enormous success. They were busy projecting an illusion of boundless wealth to their friends and followers, completely blind to the fact that their financial oxygen had just been severed at the source. I poured myself a plain cup of black coffee and watched the digital performance unfold. Cody believed he had outrun the consequences of what he'd done by crossing an ocean. He was convinced the forged documents in the stolen house were firmly behind him. He assumed Clifton Drumfield was back home, managing the tedious corporate paperwork, while he soaked up the privileges of his new stolen partnership. But Cody had no appreciation for how fast a corporate guillotine actually drops. By the time he ordered his third bottle of premium champagne on the beach, the $2.5 million demand from my holding company had already landed on Clifton Drumfield's desk. Clifton had 24 hours to produce the cash. Of course, Clifton didn't have the money. He was a fraud, living on borrowed time and leased warehouse space. When Clifton inevitably defaulted on the demand my legal team executed the prearranged injunction, we initiated a hard freeze on every bank account, credit line, and corporate card connected to the entire Drumfield enterprise. I knew the precise moment the freeze took effect. My tablet refreshed, revealing a new photo of Cody standing proudly before an enormous luxury yacht. The caption referenced the private $10,000 sunset cruise they had chartered for the evening. I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited. I could see exactly how this scene was unfolding on that tropical dock. I pictured Cody pulling out his heavy-metal Drumfield corporate credit card with a self-satisfied grin, ready to settle up with the charter captain. I could imagine the slight frown creeping onto the captain's face as the portable card reader beeped and flashed a bright red, declined message. Cody would certainly laugh it off, blaming it on an international security block, and produce a second platinum card. That one would be declined as well. Then he'd move to his personal cards, the ones already maxed out from tailored wedding suits and first-class flight upgrades. Those would fail too. In a matter of seconds, my arrogant son would go from playing corporate titan to standing on a wooden dock with absolutely no purchasing power whatsoever. The humiliation wouldn't stop at the marina. I knew they'd be forced to make their way back to the resort completely empty-handed. Once they reached the lobby, hotel management would pull them aside. The resort would have attempted to run the standard daily authorization on the card Cody had left on file, and it would have bounced. I could picture Cody pacing the bamboo floors of the lobby, insisting the concierge run the numbers again, declaring himself a partner in a major import company. He was stranded on an island paradise with a wife who demanded endless luxury, and he didn't have a single working piece of plastic in his wallet. The quiet of my study was shattered by the sharp buzz of my secure phone. The screen lit up with an incoming international number. It was Cody. It said something about his sheer arrogance that his very first move was to call the father he had just evicted. He wasn't calling to apologize. He called because he needed someone to blame. Before I answered, I reached across the desk and switched on a high-definition audio recorder. In this state, I am legally permitted to record my own phone calls, and I needed every single word of this conversation captured, with absolute clarity. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I simply held the line and waited for him to speak. His voice came through, completely stripped of the confident swagger he'd displayed on my front porch. He was breathing hard, his words tumbling out in a frantic, panicked rush. He demanded to know what was going on. He shouted that his cards were being declined everywhere and that hotel management was threatening to lock them out of their bungalow if they didn't provide a valid form of payment immediately. He told me he'd finally gotten Clifton on the phone and that Clifton was screaming about a $2.5 million demand tied to the suburban house. Cody was furious. He accused me of sabotaging his deal. He actually had the audacity to blame me for ruining his honeymoon. He shouted that I must have contacted the bank out of spite and misrepresented the property value to trigger a malicious freeze. I kept my voice perfectly calm and utterly devoid of emotion. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was referring to. I reminded him that he was the one who handed me an eviction notice and claimed legal ownership of the property. I spoke to him as though he were a confused child. I asked him how a simple supply chain manager like me could possibly set off a multi-million-dollar bank demand against an untouchable titan like Clifton Drumfield. My even tone infuriated him further. He was desperate to prove he was sharper than me. He needed to assert his dominance to convince himself he still had command of the situation. He began to brag loudly and aggressively about how effortlessly he had outsmarted me. He wanted to wound me, so he decided to spell out exactly how he'd taken my house. He shouted into the phone that I was a pathetic old fool who didn't understand the first thing about corporate leverage. I asked him quietly how he had managed to obtain the deed in the first place, since Evelyn and I had never agreed to sell the home. That was the bait, and Cody swallowed it whole. He let out a cruel, desperate laugh. He declared proudly that he hadn't needed our permission at all. He boasted about bringing a notary directly into his mother's hospital room. He bragged about how simple it was to slip the durable power of attorney into a stack of routine medical proxy forms while she was sedated on heavy painkillers. He stated outright that his mother was too drugged to read the headers on any of it, that he'd simply guided her finger to the dotted line and told her to sign. He proudly admitted to using that document to transfer the deed to Clifton Drumfield behind my back in order to secure his corporate partnership. He thought he was walking a foolish old man through a brilliant piece of business strategy. He thought he was demonstrating his superiority. What he did not grasp was that he was delivering a flawless, entirely voluntary criminal confession straight into a federal recording device. He gave me the precise date, the location, the method of deception, and his explicit intent to defraud his own mother. He laid out every element needed to lock in a conviction for felony wire fraud and serious elder financial abuse. He handed me the exact weapon I needed to take his whole life apart. I let him finish his arrogant monologue. I let him breathe heavily into the phone, waiting for my shattered reaction. He expected tears. He expected rage or cursing. He expected me to beg him to undo what he'd done. Instead, I simply told him to enjoy what was left of his honeymoon, because the weather back home was about to turn incredibly severe. I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call. I immediately stopped the recorder and pulled the digital audio file. I played it back through the speakers in my study. Cody's cruel voice bounced off the wood-paneled walls, crystal clear and utterly damning. I settled back into my leather chair and looked out at the city spread below. A deep sense of finality washed over me. Whatever doubts had still lingered about dismantling my son's future dissolved entirely the moment I heard him boast about manipulating his drugged mother. He had crossed a line from which there was no coming back. I opened a secure email client and attached the audio file. I didn't send it to Clifton Drumfield. I didn't send it to Tiffany. I sent it directly to Harlan with a single line of instruction. I told Harlan to prepare the federal dossier. The first offensive strike was complete. The financial hemorrhaging had begun. Now it was time to let the damage spread through the rest of the Drumfield empire and watch them turn on each other in their scramble to survive. The morning sun flashed hard off the polished hood of Clifton Drumfield's imported sports car. As he rolled down the highway toward the industrial district, he gripped the leather wheel with both hands, feeling like an absolute king. The wedding weekend had been a spectacular performance of smoke and mirrors. He had successfully projected the image of a billionaire tycoon to hundreds of well-heeled guests. He had watched his daughter Tiffany marry a young man who was eager to please and easily managed. And more importantly, he had secured the deed to a valuable piece of suburban real estate without parting with a single dime of his own money. Clifton felt completely untouchable. He was certain he had outmaneuvered everyone. He turned up the classical music pouring through his premium car speakers and let the triumphant sound fill the cabin. He was ready to meet the work week head-on, feeling recharged and victorious. He guided his car off the highway and took the familiar exit toward his flagship commercial property. Clifton ran his entire import operation out of 3 massive connected warehouses in the county's busiest logistics hub. Those sprawling steel structures were the beating heart of everything he'd built. Every piece of imported inventory, every delivery truck, and every corporate server lived behind those tall chain-link fences. But as he turned onto his private access road, the triumphant music suddenly felt jarring and out of place. The silence hit him immediately. No heavy diesel engines were idling at the loading docks. No forklifts were reversing with their familiar warning beeps. Every one of the massive metal loading bay doors was rolled firmly shut. Clifton slowed to a crawl as he neared the main entrance. His heart lurched when he caught the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the warehouse walls. 4 law enforcement vehicles were parked diagonally across the entry ramps in a solid blockade. Federal marshals in dark, tactical vests stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the main gate. A crew of private security contractors in high-visibility jackets was wrapping thick, heavy chains around the iron bars. Clifton stood on the brakes. He threw the car into park and jumped out, engines still running, door swinging open behind him. His face went bright red with indignant fury. He stormed toward the nearest federal marshal, demanding to know what they were doing on his property. He puffed out his chest and used the loud, overbearing tone he usually saved for intimidating underpaid staff. The marshal didn't flinch. He didn't look the least bit intimidated. He looked at Clifton with something close to mild pity and handed him a thick stack of legal documents fastened to a heavy clipboard. The marshal informed him they were executing a federal commercial lockout order. He stated that the property no longer belonged to Clifton Drumfield and that his access rights had been officially revoked. Clifton snatched the clipboard and stared at the bold black lettering across the top of the page. It was an immediate eviction and asset seizure notice issued by the parent company that owned the industrial park. That company was named Summit Holdings. A cold knot of pure panic began forming in Clifton's gut as he worked through the fine print. His entire business model depended on commercial leases. He didn't actually own the ground beneath his empire. For the past 2 months, he had deliberately ignored rent notices from his landlord. He had quietly siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from his operating budget to cover Tiffany's extravagant wedding catering and imported floral arrangements. He needed to sustain the illusion of enormous wealth for his high society guests. He had assumed Summit Holdings was a slow-moving, faceless corporate bureaucracy. He figured he could brush aside their automated warning letters and settle the late fees whenever his next shipping container cleared. He believed he was far too valuable a tenant to face any real consequences. He assumed completely wrong. Summit Holdings did not send another warning letter. They invoked a zero-tolerance commercial eviction clause buried deep in the original lease agreement. The marshals laid out the brutal reality of his situation with clinical precision. They told Clifton the lockout was absolute and total. Every physical asset inside those 3 warehouses was now legally seized by the landlord to cover the defaulted rent and breach of contract penalties. His entire stock of imported goods was locked inside. His fleet of delivery trucks was impounded behind the chained gates. His computer servers, holding all client data and financial records, were completely out of reach. He could not fulfill a single order. He could not ship a single product. He couldn't even get into his own office to retrieve his personal files. His entire company had been decapitated in a single morning. Clifton turned and looked down the sidewalk. His warehouse managers and office staff were lined up along the curb, holding cardboard boxes of personal belongings. Armed security had walked them out of the building before Clifton had even pulled into the lot. They stared at him with a mix of anger and deep betrayal. He was their boss, and he had let them down completely. He watched as a contractor snapped a heavy steel padlock through the chains on the main gate. The sharp metallic clank rang out down the empty street. It was the sound of everything he'd built collapsing to rubble. He was standing on the outside of his own empire, peering through the fence at a business he could no longer touch. He retreated to his luxury sports car and pulled the door shut hard. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock his phone. The confident, swaggering tycoon of 20 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified man watching his world burn down around him. He rang his chief financial officer, screaming into the receiver and demanding answers. The CFO sounded thoroughly defeated on the other end. He told Clifton that Summit Holdings had moved with a speed and aggression he had never witnessed in his entire career. They hadn't just padlocked the physical buildings. They had triggered emergency injunctions on the corporate surety bonds. The business was paralyzed on every conceivable front. Clifton understood he was completely out of options. He was drowning and needed a massive lifeline immediately. He told his financial officer to find out exactly who was pulling the strings at Summit Holdings. He demanded the name of the chief executive officer. He was convinced that a face-to-face meeting with the company's top executive was all he needed. He believed he could charm his way through the crisis and negotiate some kind of payment arrangement. In his desperation, he thought he could use the deed to the suburban house that Cody had just handed him as collateral to get the warehouse doors reopened. He had absolutely no idea that claiming ownership of that particular house was the precise action that had triggered a separate multi-million-dollar penalty. He believed the house was his lifeline. He had no way of knowing it was the anchor pulling him straight to the bottom. Sitting in his parked car, with the federal marshals positioned just a few feet away, Clifton started composing a frantic email on his phone. He addressed it to the legal department of Summit Holdings, essentially begging for an audience with the anonymous owner. He discarded every ounce of his pride and filled the message with desperate appeals. He asked for a 24-hour extension. He leaned on phrases like mutual partnership and future growth, trying to flatter the unseen billionaire who had just dismantled his company. He promised he could make things whole if they would only unlock the gates. He hit send and sat staring at the chained entrance to his ruined empire. He waited in the stifling quiet of his car, sweating through his expensive tailored shirt. He clung to the hope that the mysterious, wealthy owner of Summit Holdings was a reasonable man who might offer him some mercy. The supreme irony of his complete destruction was entirely lost on him. He had no idea whatsoever that the anonymous billionaire he was now on his knees begging was the very same man he had dismissed with contempt just 2 days before. He did not know that the person holding the keys to his entire existence was the man whose wife he had watched fall into the mud. Clifton Drumfield was begging Gordon Whitley to save his life. The flight back from the tropical paradise was an exercise in pure humiliation, because every credit card they had was frozen solid. Cody and Tiffany were forced to buy last-minute economy tickets, using the remaining balance on a prepaid emergency debit card. They spent 14 hours wedged into middle seats near the rear lavatory, hemmed in by crying infants and the stale odor of airplane food. Tiffany wore her designer sunglasses for the entire flight, concealing her tear-swollen eyes and refusing to say a single word to her new husband. Cody stared blankly at the plastic seatback in front of him, sweating through his expensive linen shirt. The arrogant corporate titan who had recently boasted of his vast wealth was now jammed into the very back of a commercial airliner, desperately trying to work out how his entire world had come apart. They landed in the late afternoon. The summer heat was brutal and suffocating. With no access to their premium rideshare accounts, they had to queue in a long line for a standard yellow cab. They rode in heavy silence as the driver navigated the busy highway toward the suburban neighborhood. When they finally pulled up to the house Cody had stolen from his parents, the reality of their position began to take on a physical form. The once neat lawn was already looking dry and neglected. Cody paid the driver with the last of his folded cash and hauled their bulky luxury luggage up the concrete driveway. He fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, as he worked the lock and shouldered the front door open. The house inside was like a furnace. The heavy summer air had been trapped within thick and completely still. Cody dropped the bags onto the hardwood floor and crossed to the thermostat on the wall. He jabbed the buttons several times, but the digital display stayed blank. He tried the light switches in the hallway and the living room, but the house remained dark in every direction. A slow, creeping dread settled over him. He moved to the kitchen and twisted the handle on the stainless steel faucet. A weak brown drip fell from the spout, followed by the hollow hiss of empty pipes. The utility companies hadn't merely paused their services, the bank had initiated a hard physical cutoff. The property was officially designated a distressed and foreclosed asset. Tiffany stood in the center of the airless living room, clutching her expensive handbag to her chest. She looked around the dark, sweltering space and demanded to know what was happening. She told Cody to call the electric company and pay whatever late fee was blocking the power. Cody leaned heavily against the granite kitchen counter, dragging his sleeve across his sweat-damp forehead. He tried to hold his arrogant pose together. He lied to her face, claiming that his new partnership was just working through some routine bureaucratic delays. But his voice carried no weight behind it. He was a frightened boy pretending to be a man, and his new bride was starting to see straight through the act. Before Tiffany could push him any further, the screech of tires cut through the quiet suburban street. A sleek black luxury sedan swung into the driveway at a sharp, aggressive angle. The heavy front door was flung open, and Clifton slammed it shut on his way out. He didn't bother to knock. He came straight through the stifling dark foyer, and the look etched onto his face was one of pure, undisguised fury. Clifton looked absolutely wrecked. His tailored suit was badly creased, his tie wrenched loose around his collar. The polished, prosperous tycoon who had presided over a 300-person wedding reception with such pride was nowhere to be found. In his place stood a desperate, ruined man, whose entire operation had just been padlocked behind federal chains. Clifton ignored his daughter entirely and cut straight through to where Cody was standing in the kitchen. He leveled a trembling finger at his son-in-law and demanded to know what kind of poisoned asset Cody had dropped in his lap. Clifton shouted that his entire import business had been shut down by federal marshals because the anonymous landlord had exercised an immediate commercial lockout. But that was not even the worst of it. Clifton laid out the catastrophic mistake Cody had made. He yelled that by accepting the deed to this specific suburban house, they had tripped a hidden corporate balloon mortgage. He told Cody the bank was demanding immediate repayment of $2.5 million. Clifton slammed both fists on the granite counter and ordered Cody to use his supposed personal fortune to clean up the enormous debt he had triggered. Cody stumbled back, eyes wide, with a look of profound shock. In that moment, he understood that his father had laid an invisible, flawless trap. But rather than face what he had done, Cody did exactly what he had always done. He deflected. He screamed right back at Clifton. He demanded that Clifton pay him the generous partnership salary he'd been promised at the wedding. Cody shouted that his own cards were being declined and that he needed his executive signing bonus immediately to handle his mounting personal debts. He told Clifton to liquidate the import warehouses to cover the $2.5 million. It was a staggering display of ignorance. Cody still hadn't grasped that those warehouses were entirely leased and that Clifton owned none of the commercial property his business ran on. Tiffany stood watching the two men shout at each other in that dark, sweltering kitchen. The pieces clicked into place in her mind with quiet, merciless speed. She looked at her father, the man she had believed to be an untouchable billionaire, begging for a bailout. She looked at her new husband, the man she had taken to be a secret trust fund heir, demanding a salary to cover basic credit card debt. The entire foundation of her marriage crumbled to nothing in a matter of seconds. She understood that they were all completely broke. There was no corporate empire, no bottomless bank account, and no glittering future waiting for her. She had married a fraud, who had forged documents to steal a debt-ridden house from his own parents. And her father had used her wedding as a curtain to hide his complete financial collapse. Tiffany let out a shrill, piercing scream that stopped both men cold. She hurled her expensive handbag across the kitchen, where it caught a glass vase on the counter and sent it shattering across the floor. She stepped up to Cody and shoved him hard in the chest. She screamed that he was a pathetic, broke liar. She told him he was nothing but a supply chain manager's son who'd had to forge paperwork just to feel like he mattered. She yelled that she had wasted the best years of her life on a man who couldn't even keep the lights running in a house he had stolen. She was no longer the smug bride laughing in the rain. She was a woman buried in debt, standing in the dark. Clifton watched his daughter go after his son-in-law, and something cold and calculating shifted behind his eyes. The panic in his face slowly gave way to a ruthless survival instinct. Clifton was a shark who had spent decades threading his way through the murky waters of commercial logistics. He knew when a vessel was going under, and he knew precisely who to throw overboard to keep himself afloat. He recognized that the $2.5 million debt and the federal lockouts were all legally anchored to the fraudulent deed transfer. What I'm about to share next changed the entire shape of everything that followed. The man on the other side of that table believed he still had options. He had no idea how completely the ground had already shifted beneath him. I want to ask you something before we get there. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait, gather everything, and let them walk into it themselves? He understood that Cody was the sole source of the toxic infection that had just destroyed the business he'd built. Clifton slowly drew himself upright and buttoned his creased suit jacket. He fixed Cody with a look of absolute contempt and told him he was a massive liability. Clifton stated with cold calm that he had no intention of going down for a federal crime committed by a reckless, arrogant kid. He made clear that the forged signature on the medical documents belonged to Cody alone. Clifton laid out his new plan with chilling precision. He announced he would walk straight into the district attorney's office the following morning. He was going to hand over the fraudulent property deed and swear under oath that Cody had acted entirely on his own. Clifton was prepared to trade his son-in-law to federal prosecutors in a desperate bid to secure his own corporate immunity. Cody stood frozen in the dark kitchen as the full weight of it crashed over him like ice water. The father-in-law he had betrayed everything to impress was now going to serve as the star witness in his federal prosecution. The arrogant alliance was stone dead, and Cody was completely alone. The elevator doors parted with a soft, expensive chime, opening onto the top floor of Summit Holdings Tower. Clifton straightened his tie, his palms slick with nervous sweat. He was running on pure adrenaline and desperation, having spent the past 48 hours watching his entire import empire sit locked behind federal chains. He had pulled every string, called in every contact, and practically begged the legal department for an emergency audience with the anonymous CEO of this baseless holding company. He needed those warehouse doors opened today, or his business was finished for good. Walking slightly behind him were Cody and Tiffany. Clifton had brought them along for one specific reason. He intended to throw his arrogant son-in-law directly under the bus. He planned to present Cody to the Summit board as a rogue, desperate young man who had forged legal documents entirely without Clifton's knowledge. He was going to use Tiffany to play the victim, the innocent bride who had been deceived by a fraudulent husband. Clifton believed that if he handed the board a queer scapegoat, they might show leniency and lift the commercial lockout. A sharp-faced receptionist led them down a wide corridor lined with modern art and frosted glass panels. Clifton tried to project an air of confident prosperity, but his rumpled suit and hollow eyes undermined the performance. He was a man walking toward his own execution, hoping he could talk his way free of the rope. Cody walked with his head down, terrified of the federal wire fraud charges hanging over him. Tiffany gripped her designer handbag and directed a look of undisguised hatred at her husband. The poisoned alliance that had been forged at the wedding reception was completely gone, replaced by a frantic scramble for individual survival. The receptionist pushed open a set of heavy mahogany doors and gestured for them to enter the main boardroom. The room was striking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the entire city skyline, the very same view I took in every morning from my private office. The conference table was enormous, polished to a mirror finish. Several executives in crisp suits sat along both sides, their expressions completely unreadable. But it was the chair at the head of the table that pulled every eye in the room. The high-backed leather chair was turned away, facing the city spread below, keeping the CEO hidden from view. Clifton stepped into the room and cleared his throat, reaching for the domineering swagger he had used to bend so many people to his will over the years. He announced himself, stating that he was Clifton Drumfield and that he was there to negotiate a mutually beneficial resolution to the unfortunate commercial lockout situation. He spoke with loud confidence, assuming the man in the chair was simply another corporate shark he could charm or buy off. The executives seated at the table said nothing. They did not offer Clifton a seat. They simply waited. The heavy leather chair slowly turned around. Clifton stopped speaking at once. His mouth fell open slightly, the arrogant words dying somewhere in his throat. Cody lurched back, a stumbling half-step, actually catching himself against the mahogany doorframe. Tiffany let out a small, strangled gasp, both hands flying up to cover her mouth. Every trace of color drained from their faces, leaving all three of them looking like ghosts confronting something entirely impossible. I sat at the head of the table in a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, hands folded calmly over a thick leather-bound dossier. I did not look like the tired supply chain manager they had dismissed. I did not look like the old man they had handed an eviction notice. I looked precisely like what I was, the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and the man who held their entire futures in the palm of his hand. The silence in that boardroom was absolute. All you could make out was the faint hum of traffic rising from the street far below. Clifton stared at me, eyes wide, with a deep and shattering comprehension spreading across his face. The pieces locked together in his mind with devastating force. The sweeping commercial lockout, the sudden $2.5 million demand, the surgically timed financial freeze. This had never been a faceless corporate bureaucracy. It had been a targeted, precise strike, carried out by the man he had humiliated just days ago. Cody looked at me, his entire body shaking. The arrogant son who had laughed while his mother was pushed into the mud was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified boy who had finally grasped the true scale of the mistake he had made. He had tried to steal a house from a man who owned the city. He had tried to play corporate games with the man who had written the rules. I let all three of them stand there for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the full weight of their situation to settle deep into their bones. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. Real power has no need to shout. I lifted the thick dossier and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany surface. The heavy folder came to rest directly in front of Clifton. I held his gaze, my voice perfectly level, carrying the full gravity of absolute authority. "Welcome to my office, Clifton," I said quietly. "Let's talk about your debt." Clifton reached for the dossier with hands that were shaking so badly he could barely get hold of the leather cover. He opened it and looked at the pages inside. I had no need to glance at the documents to know exactly what he was reading. I had personally assembled every single page in that file. The first page was the master lease agreement for the 3 commercial warehouses that housed the Drumfield Imports warehouses. I watched his eyes travel to the bottom of the page where the parent company's signature appeared on every renewal. I told him to look carefully at the ink. I told him to take note of the name that had been signing his lease renewals for the past decade. It was my name. I explained that he had not been renting space from some faceless corporate entity. He had been renting his entire livelihood from me. I owned the concrete his trucks rolled across. I owned the steel walls that sheltered his inventory. And because he had chosen to fund his daughter's lavish wedding instead of paying his commercial rent, I now owned every piece of imported inventory locked inside those buildings. Clifton moved his mouth to speak, but his throat had gone completely dry. He swallowed with an audible effort, the sound of a man choking on his own arrogance. I did not give him a moment to collect himself. I told him to turn to the second page. It was the acceleration clause tied to the toxic balloon mortgage. I spoke with quiet, clinical precision, letting each word strike with the force of something physical. I explained that when my son handed him the forged deed to my suburban home, Clifton had enthusiastically accepted stolen property. By using that stolen deed to secure a commercial bailout loan, he had officially bound the Drumfield corporate structure to my hidden financial trap. I told him the $2.5 million demand was not a clerical error. It was a legally binding execution of debt. I looked at the proud tycoon who had sipped champagne while my wife lay weeping in the dirt. I told him his company was currently in receivership. His bank accounts were completely frozen. He was officially bankrupt and facing serious federal scrutiny for receiving fraudulent collateral across state lines. The illusion of his vast empire was dead in every direction. Then I shifted my attention to the bride. Tiffany stood motionless near the far edge of the massive mahogany table. The smug certainty she had worn on my front porch the day she handed me the eviction notice had vanished entirely. She looked like a ghost pinned under the cold fluorescent light of the boardroom. I slid a separate, considerably thinner folder across the polished wood directly toward her. I told her to open it. I told her she deserved to see the precise financial picture of the man she had chosen to marry. She hesitated, her manicured fingers trembling as she lifted the cover. I didn't wait for her to read it. I recited the numbers from memory so the entire board of executives could hear exactly what kind of fraud was standing before them. I walked through Cody's maxed-out credit cards one by one. I listed the exorbitant personal loans he had taken out to fund his tailored suits and his first-class honeymoon to St. Bart's. I made clear that Cody held absolutely zero equity in the Drumfield company because his entire partnership buy-in was built on a forged, stolen, and deeply toxic asset. I watched the understanding move across her pale face. She had married a man purely for his supposed wealth and corporate ambition, only to find she had bound herself to a flat-broke criminal. I looked at her immaculate designer outfit and reminded her that every luxury she was wearing at that moment had been financed with fraudulent debt. I told her that the shoes she had used to shove my wife into the mud were purchased with stolen money. The atmosphere inside that boardroom fractured completely. The full reality of their destruction descended on them like a building coming down. Clifton Drumfield, the man who had constructed his entire identity on physically dominating others, collapsed. His knees hit the carpeted floor with a dull, heavy thud. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table and looked up at me, with tears streaming down his face. He begged me for a payment plan. He pleaded with me to open the warehouse gates, swearing he would spend the rest of his life paying off the debt. He offered to sign his entire company over to me if I would just pull the federal marshals back and release his inventory. He wept openly, surrendering every last scrap of his pride. I looked down at him, kneeling exactly where I needed him to be, and felt absolutely nothing. He was settling the account his arrogance had run up. Beside him, the shock in Tiffany's eyes curdled into pure, undiluted rage. She looked at her father weeping on his knees and understood that her new husband was the single reason her entire privileged existence was burning down around her. She turned toward Cody. She didn't shout immediately. She simply raised her hand and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap across his face. The crack of it cut through the silent boardroom, a perfect echo of the same physical violence she and her father had inflicted on my wife at the reception. She screamed that he was a liar. She screamed that he had destroyed her life and gutted her family. She cursed him for pretending to be a wealthy heir when he was nothing but a pathetic thief. Cody stumbled backward, pressing his hand to his red, stinging cheek, completely paralyzed by the collapse of everything around him. The executives at the table observed the scene with cold detachment. Cody swept his eyes around the room, searching for a single sympathetic expression, and finding nothing but severe judgment. He finally looked away from his furious wife and turned his panicked eyes toward me. The arrogant corporate raider was entirely gone. He looked exactly like the frightened little boy who used to break things in the garage and count on me to quietly clean up the damage. His chest heaved as he took a step forward, his voice fracturing under the weight of his total undoing. "Dad," he whispered the word, hanging in that vast glass room. "How do we fix this?" I settled back into my leather chair and folded my hands over the dossier. I looked at the son who had laughed at his mother's humiliation. I looked at the man who had guided a drugged woman's hand to a dotted line while she lay in a hospital bed. "We don't," I replied, my voice carrying not a trace of fatherly warmth. "You evicted me. I'm just your landlord now." The silence that followed was absolute. Cody stood there with the red imprint of his wife's hand still burning on his cheek. He was waiting for me to extend a lifeline. He was waiting for the father who had cleaned up every mess and absorbed every mistake to somehow make the $2.5 million demand vanish into thin air. I didn't move a single muscle toward helping him. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I drew out a small black digital audio player. I set it down gently on the polished mahogany table, right alongside the thick dossier cataloging his financial ruin. Clifton was still on the floor, weeping quietly into his hands. Tiffany was breathing hard, staring at Cody with a hatred so concentrated it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. The board executives remained completely still, watching a family come apart in real time. I looked at Cody and told him his greatest mistake was not stealing from me. His greatest mistake was believing I was stupid. I pressed play. The audio was flawless, crystal clear. It rang off the floor-to-ceiling glass and filled the entire corporate space. It was the precise recording of the phone call Cody had placed to me from his luxury bungalow in St. Bart's. My own calm, measured voice came first, asking him a simple question about how he had managed to secure the deed to my house. Then came his answer. Cody heard his own arrogant voice booming back at him through the boardroom. He heard himself laugh, that cruel, mocking sound. He stood in absolute horror as his recorded voice walked through the entire scheme with obvious pride. The recording detailed exactly how he had brought the notary into the hospital room. It captured him bragging about slipping the durable power of attorney into a pile of routine medical proxy forms. Everyone in the room heard him state outright that his mother was heavily sedated on painkillers and too blurry-eyed to read the headers on any of it. His own voice boasted about pointing to the dotted line and telling her to sign. Cody stood motionless in front of the table. Every drop of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He understood he was hearing his own voluntary criminal confession played back to him. Tiffany pressed both hands over her mouth and took another step away from him as if proximity to him had become dangerous. Even Clifton stopped his sobbing and lifted his eyes from the carpet, his expression overtaken by a new and deeper level of terror. They all understood exactly what that recording meant. I reached out and pressed pause. The silence that replaced the audio felt heavier than the sound itself. I looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly steady, emptied of any remaining trace of paternal feeling. I told him he believed he was executing a clever corporate maneuver, What he had actually done, I explained, was commit severe elder financial abuse against a vulnerable patient recovering from surgery. I watched his chest labor as he struggled to pull in air. I continued the clinical dismantling of what he had done. I told him that when he took that forged document and presented it to a commercial bank to secure a $500,000 loan for Clifton, he committed grand larceny. And because the bank he defrauded was headquartered in another state, and because he authorized the electronic transfer of those funds while sitting on a tropical island, he had committed federal wire fraud. I watched his knees begin to visibly tremble. I walked him through the brutal reality of the federal justice system. These were not simple civil disputes that could be resolved with a penalty check or a bankruptcy filing. These specific felonies carry mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. There is no parole in the federal system. I told him he was not facing a financial consequence. He was looking at spending the most productive years of his life inside a concrete cell. Cody began shaking his head back and forth in slow, desperate denial. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stared at the audio player on the table, as though it were a weapon aimed at his chest. He finally grasped the precise, airtight nature of the trap I had constructed. I hadn't simply allowed him to steal a house. I had handed him the rope he needed to hang himself. And then I had quietly recorded him kicking the chair away. He dropped into one of the heavy leather boardroom chairs and gripped the armrests with white knuckles. He asked me in a voice barely above a whisper whether I was truly going to use that recording to destroy him. I told him he had destroyed himself the moment he decided his mother's safety was worth less than a hollow corporate title. I told him I was simply the man delivering the receipt for everything he had chosen to purchase. Clifton slowly hauled himself up off the floor, leaning his full weight against the table edge. He wasted no time trying to separate himself from Cody. Clifton stammered that he had absolutely no idea the power of attorney was forged. He claimed to be an innocent victim of Cody's deception. I looked at Clifton and told him that ignorance of a crime does not excuse the possession of stolen assets. I reminded him that he'd eagerly taken a multi-million-dollar property without asking a single question because his greed had made him blind to everything else. He was just as culpable for receiving fraudulent funds and moving them across state lines. The tension in that room hit an absolute breaking point. Cody was weeping silently, face buried in his hands, completely crushed under the weight of what was coming for him. Tiffany had gone entirely numb, staring blankly at the polished wood table, the full erasure of her future sinking in. I settled back in my chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I told them our meeting was officially concluded. Cody looked up, eyes red and swollen. He asked whether I intended to call the police. I gave him a smile, cold, precise, and perfectly polite. I told him he had a fundamental misunderstanding of how corporate executives deal with fraud on this scale. I don't call the local police. I prefer to engage specialized professionals. At that precise moment, the heavy walnut doors of the boardroom swung open. Harlan, my lead attorney, stepped into the room. He wasn't carrying his usual leather briefcase. He held a single manila envelope. But Harlan hadn't come in alone. He was flanked by two tall figures in dark suits with serious, unreadable expressions. They entered the boardroom with a heavy, authoritative presence that instantly commanded every corner of the room. One of the men reached into his breast pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a shining gold badge. He identified himself as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The last trace of color drained from Cody's face. I looked at my son and laid out the final piece. I told him I hadn't brought that audio recording to this meeting simply to watch him squirm. I told him I had handed the complete digital dossier, the financial traces, the forged signatures, the vocal confession, directly to the federal prosecutor more than an hour ago. The trap hadn't merely been sprung. The steel jaws had snapped completely shut. The special agent moved forward. His polished shoes made no sound against the thick carpet. He didn't raise his voice. He had no need to. The badge in his hand carried all the authority in the world. He looked directly at Cody and stated his full name. He recited the federal charges with a practiced robotic efficiency. Wire fraud, grand larceny, elder financial abuse. Every word hung in the cold air of that glass room like a stone dropped from a great height. The second agent came around the far side of the massive mahogany table. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Cody stumbled backward. He bumped hard into the floor-to-ceiling window. He looked like a cornered animal. He raised both hands in front of his chest as though he could physically push the charges away from him. He shook his head in frantic denial. He told the agents there had been a mistake. He told them he was a partner in a major import corporation. He jabbed a trembling finger in my direction and shouted that I was nothing but a bitter old man trying to destroy his business deal. The agent didn't argue. He simply took hold of Cody's wrist and twisted my son's arm behind his back with one swift, practiced motion. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs rang out through the silence of the boardroom, the most definitive sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a life ending. Clifton was still on his knees on the floor. He watched the agents secure his son-in-law. He began scrambling backward across the carpet like a crab desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and Cody. Clifton raised both hands in surrender. He stammered that he was entirely innocent. He wept that he had been manipulated by a rogue employee. He offered to testify against Cody in a court of law. He promised to hand over his entire company ledger if they would simply allow him to walk out of the building. The lead agent shifted his attention to Clifton. He drew a second pair of handcuffs from his belt. He looked down at the weeping, ruined tycoon and read out a separate list of federal charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Accepting stolen assets across state lines. The agent explained that ignorance is not a valid legal defense when you accept a stolen multi-million-dollar property to secure a fraudulent corporate bailout. The agent hauled Clifton up from the carpet. He secured Clifton's hands behind his back with no ceremony whatsoever. The proud, arrogant father of the bride was now nothing more than a common federal suspect. He sobbed openly. He begged for his lawyer. He begged for mercy. Nobody in that room offered him a single ounce of pity. Cody began to panic. The reality of the cold steel locked around his wrists finally broke through his delusion. He understood he wasn't heading to a luxury hotel. He wasn't going back to his stolen house. He was going to a federal holding cell. He started to hyperventilate. He turned to me with wild, terrified eyes. He begged me to tell the agents to stop. He pleaded with me to call off the lawyers. He swore he'd give the house back. He swore he'd spend the rest of his life paying off the debt. He called me Dad over and over again. His voice cracked and splintered into high-pitched sobs. I didn't move. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair and watched the consequences of his own choices consume him whole. The heavy wooden doors of the boardroom opened one final time. The room went completely silent. Evelyn walked through the doorway. My wife was absolutely breathtaking. She was not the humiliated, weeping woman sitting in the mud at a wedding reception. She wore a tailored midnight blue suit that perfectly matched mine. Her silver hair was styled immaculately. Her posture was straight and proud. She carried the quiet, unshakable dignity of a queen stepping into her throne room. She walked gracefully to my side and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. She looked at the two handcuffed men standing in the center of our corporate boardroom. Cody stopped struggling against the federal agents. He looked at his mother. Tears ran freely down his face. His arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He reverted in an instant to a frightened little boy. He dropped to his knees, pulling the agents down with him. He sobbed and called out to her. He begged her for forgiveness. He told her he was so sorry for everything. He told her he'd been confused, stressed, and desperate. He brought up the times she used to hold him when he was sick. He brought up the science projects and the birthday parties. He weaponized every maternal memory he could reach for, searching for any crack in her armor. He pleaded with her to tell the agents to release him. He told her he couldn't survive inside a federal prison. Evelyn looked down at him. Her face gave nothing away. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply listened to his desperate, pathetic apologies. She looked at the son she had raised. She looked at the man who had tricked her into signing away her safe haven while she was submerged in heavy painkillers. Then her gaze shifted. She looked past Cody. She looked directly at Tiffany. Tiffany stood frozen near the wall, trembling inside her expensive designer clothes. Evelyn dropped her eyes and looked specifically at Tiffany's shoes. They were the same custom white silk shoes Tiffany had worn on her wedding day. The same shoes she had on when she violently shoved Evelyn off the stone patio. Because Cody and Tiffany were completely bankrupt, their credit cards frozen and their accounts seized, Tiffany hadn't been able to afford a trip to the dry cleaners. The expensive white silk was still heavily stained with dark, dried mud. The exact same mud Evelyn had fallen into. Evelyn stared at the dried mud on those designer shoes. It was the ultimate physical proof of their cruelty and their current pathetic poverty. It was an undeniable reminder of how they had treated her when they believed they held all the power. Evelyn didn't need to say a single word. She lifted her head. She looked at Cody one final time. Her eyes were completely empty of maternal love. The well of her forgiveness had run entirely dry. Evelyn turned her back on her son. She faced the sprawling windows looking out over the glittering city that we owned. She did not look back. Cody's screams echoed off the glass walls. He wailed for his mother as the federal agents pulled him to his feet. They dragged him toward the boardroom doors. He thrashed and kicked, but the agents were far stronger. They hauled him down the hallway toward the elevators. Clifton was dragged out right behind him, weeping and apologizing to the empty air. The heavy walnut doors swung shut, sealing off the sound of Cody's desperate, pathetic cries. The elevator chimed. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. I got to my feet, fastened my jacket, and rested my hand over Evelyn's. The two of us stood there in the stillness of that boardroom, unburdened and at peace. The malignancy had been cut clean from our family. Tiffany remained where she was, alone, at the center of that enormous glass room. No handcuffs on her wrists, no agent reaching for her arm. Her name hadn't appeared on a single forged document, so the federal men had no use for her. But what awaited her was far crueler than any arrest could have been. She stood there, shaking under those bright overhead lights, as the full weight of her reality pressed down on her all at once. She had chosen her husband for his money and what his name could buy her. Every person who'd gotten in her way, she had trampled. And now, every account was empty. Every card was declined. There wasn't a dollar she could touch. The house she'd moved into, a house that was never hers to take. She'd already been thrown out of, legally. Tonight, she had nowhere to lay her head. Her father was being processed into a federal holding cell, while her brand new husband stared down a mandatory minimum in a federal penitentiary. What remained to her was the outfit on her body and a pair of mud-caked white wedding shoes. We offered her nothing, not a glance, not a syllable. We turned and walked out and left her there to stand alone inside the ruins she had built. A fortnight had gone by since those heavy walnut doors had swung shut on my son's life of arrogance. The cascade of federal indictments, seized corporate assets, and very public disgrace had rolled through the city like a tide flooding the local financial news cycle. Evelyn and I kept our distance from the broadcasts. There was nothing we needed to witness in the televised collapse of people who had come for us and lost. Our days were spent in the calm refuge of our penthouse, slowly reclaiming everything those months of torment had taken from us. The poisonous strain of stress that had settled on my wife, it was simply gone. When she smiled now, she meant it. What our son had done to us would never fully leave our story. But it no longer had its hands on the wheel. We were looking ahead. On a Tuesday evening, the city took a beating from a relentless driving rain. It pounded the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse and turned the lights of the financial district below into long smears of gold and red. Evelyn and I had planned a quiet dinner at a private place across town. We rode the biometric elevator down into the secured underground garage beneath the building. That subterranean vault of concrete was hushed and cold, burning white, under row after row of fluorescent tubes. There was a faint smell to it, wet pavement, expensive oil. I clicked the key fob, and my sedan answered with a flash of its lights somewhere in the distance. We started walking toward it. That's when a small, hunched shape separated itself from the concrete pillar directly next to my spot. Evelyn's hand tightened on my arm. I moved a half step ahead of her and held my face perfectly still as the figure came forward into the overhead glare. It was Tiffany. Somehow she had made it through the building's security, a delivery entrance maybe, or a service gate that hadn't closed fast enough. The creature standing before me bore no resemblance whatsoever to the imperious bride who had floated down the aisle in a custom silk gown, expecting the world to genuflect. She was unrecognizable. What she wore looked like it had come off a clearance rack and fit her like it belonged to someone else. A thin raincoat soaked to the fiber clung to her shivering body. The freezing rain had flattened her hair against her scalp. Every trace of the expensive, carefully constructed face she used to show the world had been washed away. She wrapped her own arms around herself for warmth and stood there like something abandoned, hollowed out, and cornered. Every glittering social connection she used to name drop had evaporated the instant federal marshals froze her father's accounts. The boutiques that used to fawn over her, the country clubs that used to welcome her, all shut. She had constructed her whole self out of money that wasn't hers. And once that scaffolding collapsed, she stopped existing in the only world she'd ever cared about. "Gordon, please," she said, barely above a whisper, the words dissolving against the concrete. The entitlement she normally weaponized was nowhere in her voice. She sounded hollowed out, diminished. She inched forward with her gaze dropped toward the wet floor. "I have nowhere else to go." I didn't produce a towel. I didn't ask how she'd slipped past the front desk. I stood with my keys in my hand and said nothing, giving her room to explain what gave her the right to corner my wife and me in the lower level of our own home. Her eyes traveled up to Evelyn's face, searching for a soft spot, some thread of maternal feeling she could pull. Evelyn returned that look without flinching, a gaze like a sealed door. My wife had nothing left for the woman who had put her hands on her and knocked her into the mud. "I did not know," Tiffany stammered, clutching the wet lapels of her coat. The crying started, but it had the texture of a performance. I had no idea what Cody and my father had in motion. They deceived me from day one. They told me Cody was a man of means, a legitimate heir. My father engineered the whole marriage to shore up his own corporate position. I was a chess piece, Gordon. A piece they moved wherever it suited them. They used me the same way they used you and Evelyn. I am just as much a victim here. The boldness of that story was genuinely something to behold. She had descended into my parking garage to try to sand down and repaint the entire record of what she had done. She wanted me to picture her as some hapless figure caught in a current pulled by ruthless men. She wanted me to wipe from my memory the self-satisfied look on her face when she served me that eviction notice at my own front door. She wanted me to dismiss altogether the way she had ground my wife down day after day for sport. "I need a loan," she said, the words tumbling out in a sudden rush. "I need to retain a divorce attorney so I can put legal distance between myself and your son before his trial. I need first and last month's rent on something small, just $10,000, Gordon. To you, that is nothing. That is something you lose in a coat pocket. I will put my name on any agreement you like. Every cent comes back to you, with interest, once I am back on solid ground. Please, I am in a cheap motel right now, and I run out of money tomorrow." I left those words where she'd dropped them, floating in the cold damp of the garage. My voice when I used it was quiet and even measured, so that each word reached her cleanly above the rain hammering through the vents above us. I told her she was a thoroughly unconvincing liar. I laid out for her that she had never been anyone's victim. I pointed out that she had leaned into the cruelty, chosen it, enjoyed it, because she was certain it would pay for the life she wanted. I described her precisely for what she was. I said she put my wife on the ground because she believed she was beyond consequence. That eviction notice she delivered to my door? She savored that. The feeling of pressing her heel into someone she'd written off as powerless. The source of the money was never her concern, so long as there were yachts to charter and champagne to import. What she regretted was not the harm she'd caused. It was misjudging how the whole thing would end. These weren't tears of conscience. They were tears of someone who had finally arrived at the bill for everything she'd done. Tiffany held my gaze, her jaw working silently. Every pretense of victimhood evaporated, and what was underneath was raw and desperate. "You are sitting on millions," she said, the whisper sharpened with resentment. "You can dismantle my father and put your own flesh and blood in a cell, but a few $1,000s to help a woman you've broken, that you won't do." "I didn't break you," I said, my tone unchanged. "You managed that on your own, the day you concluded that a human being's dignity was worth less than a brand name." My hand moved to the inner pocket of my jacket. Tiffany's eyes snapped to it, and something pitiful and eager ignited in her expression. She had decided the speech was the tax, that once I'd made my point, out would come the checkbook, and she could take the money and go. She was convinced the begging had landed. My hand came back out. No checkbook in it. What I held between my fingers was a small, stiff white rectangle of cardstock. I held it out toward her. She took it with trembling hands and angled it up toward the fluorescent light overhead to make out the text. A business card. Printed across it in clean, bold lettering, Summit Commercial Sanitation Services. One of the subsidiaries sitting beneath my holding company, I said, my voice carrying not a trace of warmth. Their crews handle overnight deep cleaning for industrial slaughterhouses and public transit stations. The work destroys your body. Shifts run from midnight straight through to dawn. The pay is whatever the state sets as the absolute floor for legal wages. Tiffany looked up from the card with her eyes stretched wide horror mixed with deeply wounded pride. Her mouth opened. She was gearing up to protest, to announce that she was far too good to scrub concrete floors at 2 a.m. I closed that off before a single word came out. "I will not give you a loan," I said. "I will not hand you one dime to fund a divorce attorney. But if you dial that number first thing tomorrow and tell the dispatch manager you're ready to work, they will put a mop and a bucket in your hands. If a roof over your head is what you want, you are going to have to blister your palms earning it, the same as everyone else." I turned away from her and pulled open the passenger door for my wife. Evelyn settled into the leather seat without giving Tiffany so much as a parting look. I came around to the driver's side, got in, and turned the key. The engine came alive with a low, powerful hum that rolled through the concrete around us. I shifted into gear and eased out of the space. In the rearview mirror, I took one last look. Tiffany was standing alone beneath the sterile overhead lights, shivering inside her saturated coat, staring at that small white card in her hand, like she couldn't quite process what it meant. The heavy automated security gate ground open, letting a blast of freezing rain sweep into the garage. She had nothing left to do but turn around and walk back out into that storm. Soaked, broke, and stripped of every last shred of dignity she'd once carried like a crown. 6 months ground by with the slow, unyielding machinery of the federal justice system. The seasons turned beyond the courthouse walls, but the stone and timber inside remained cold and unmoved. I sat in the front row of the gallery with Evelyn's hand locked inside mine. The room was enormous, dark polished oak on every surface, and a silence that pressed down on you like a physical weight. The rows behind us were packed with financial journalists, local reporters, and curious members of the public who had tracked the Drumfield import empire's very public implosion with something close to hunger. But the crowd held no interest for me. My attention stayed fixed on the two men seated at the defense tables, Clifton Drumfield, and my son Cody sat side by side in identical loose-fitting orange prison jumpsuits. Heavy metal chains bound their wrists and ankles, clinking loudly against the wooden chairs whenever either of them moved. The change in them was total and devastating. Gone were the custom-tailored suits, the imported watches, the smug expressions they'd worn the day of the wedding. Clifton looked as though 20 years had descended on him since I last saw him in my boardroom. His hair had gone thin and completely white, and his shoulders were caved forward as if the weight of the room was slowly pressing him into the floor. Cody looked pale and hollowed out. He sat staring at the scarred tabletop in front of him, his jaw moving faintly under the harsh lights, as though he were silently rehearsing words he could never say. They were no longer corporate power brokers or confident predators. They were two federal inmates waiting to learn how many years of their lives a judge was about to take from them. The bench door opened and the judge entered. Everyone rose in silence. She was a precise, formidable woman, decades behind her on the federal bench, a specialist in corporate fraud and elder abuse. She had no interest in ceremony. She opened the thick legal file before her, fixed her gaze on the defendants, and let her contempt for them sit openly on her face. Her voice was sharp and clear, carrying to every corner of the high-ceilinged room. She started with Clifton. In the span of a few minutes, she dismantled everything he had ever built, calling him a desperate predator who constructed a fraudulent house of cards and propped it up with stolen family money when it began to fall. She told him that his appetite for wealth had ruined his own daughter and erased whatever legacy he might otherwise have left behind. She sentenced Clifton to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Beyond that, she signed a permanent binding injunction barring him from ever holding a corporate executive position or serving on any board of directors for the remainder of his life. Clifton buried his face in his chained hands and began to sob loudly. His empire was dead. He would leave this earth a disgraced and broken man. Then the judge turned to my son. She looked at Cody and stated plainly that his offenses were especially reprehensible, precisely because he had aimed them at his own family. She walked the court through how he had preyed on a vulnerable woman, still recovering from surgery in a hospital bed. She said without any softening that elder financial abuse and wire fraud are acts of profound cowardice and moral collapse. Cody rose from his chair, chains rattling through the silence. He could barely hold himself upright. The judge extended him no mercy whatsoever. She sentenced him to 12 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early release. 12 years inside a concrete cell. Cody let out a strangled gasp, barely audible, choked off. He swayed, and his defense attorney had to seize his arm to prevent him from going down entirely. The prosecutor got to his feet and announced that the court would now receive the victim impact statement. I squeezed Evelyn's hand one final time and rose from the bench. I walked the length of the center aisle and positioned myself at the wooden podium facing the judge. I adjusted the microphone. The whole room leaned forward, bracing for fury, for shouting, for tears, for a man finally releasing months of anguish in front of a packed gallery. I gave them none of that. My voice stayed quiet and precise, each word delivered with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. I told the court I had not come looking for vengeance, because vengeance is an emotion, and I had burned through every emotion I possessed for the man at that defense table, a long time ago. I described the boy I had raised. I talked about the child who used to stand beside me washing the car on Sunday mornings. The teenager who had looked me in the eye and sworn he would build an honest life. And then I described what happened to that boy. I laid out how a slow, creeping hunger for wealth had worked its way into him, how the need to appear successful, to buy status he hadn't earned, had quietly hollowed him out from the inside, until there was nothing left of who he had been. I told the court that Cody had not done this out of desperation or necessity. He had done it out of pure, unchecked arrogance. He wanted to purchase the respect of a fraudulent tycoon and a shallow woman, and he decided his own mother's safety and security were a reasonable price to pay for that seat at the table. I turned from the judge and looked straight at Cody. He slowly dragged his eyes up to meet mine. They were wet with tears that looked finally like genuine grief. I addressed him directly, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. I told him he had spent his entire life looking down on his parents, convinced we were beneath him because we lived in a modest suburban home and chose to drive sensible, reliable old cars rather than parade around in something designed to impress strangers. He was so consumed by his need to belong among powerful people that he falsified medical documents to steal real estate simply to buy the approval of a family that was itself built on fraud. I let the silence open up after that and left it there long enough that the room felt it. Then I told him the truth that would finish him. The holding company he had tried to defraud, the entity behind the high-rise office towers, the luxury retail centers, and the sweeping industrial logistics properties, belonged to me. I had spent 40 years assembling that quiet, invisible empire, through discipline and deliberate discretion, building it specifically to secure his future. I told him the exact shape of what his arrogance had cost him. Every asset, every commercial building, every substantial bank account, every acre of land. It had already been placed inside a trust with his name on it as the sole beneficiary. Cody stopped breathing. His eyes went wide in a way I had never seen on a grown man's face. The tears ceased entirely, replaced by an expression of raw, uncomprehending horror. He stared at me as the full mass of that truth came down on what remained of him. I told him he had never needed to forge a medical proxy to take a summer estate. He had no reason to go crawling to Clifton Drumfield for a fraudulent corporate partnership. He was the only heir to an actual billionaire empire. All he had ever needed to do to inherit everything was be a decent son. I watched him physically collapse under the weight of that understanding. It struck him like something falling from a great height. He had discarded a multi-billion-dollar legacy for a bankrupt import company and a bride whose shoes were caked in mud. He had surrendered a kingdom for a prison cell. His mouth fell open, but nothing came out. The destruction was total and could never be undone. I didn't wait for him to find his voice. Everything that needed saying had been said. I stepped back from the microphone, came down from the wooden podium, and returned to my wife's side. I didn't look at him again. The late afternoon sun stretched long ribbons of golden light across the rolling hills of our new countryside estate. A soft breeze moved through the open terrace, carrying jasmine and lavender on it. I stood near the edge of the broad stone patio and took in the sheer depth of the quiet we had finally won. This was nothing like the modest suburban home where we had spent 3 decades trying to instill in our son some sense of humility. That house was behind us now, sold to a young couple who saw the beauty in its quiet simplicity. What surrounded us now was something else entirely. A sweeping architectural statement in natural stone and rich mahogany, sitting on 50 acres of unspoiled private land. We built this retreat with the proceeds from the full liquidation of Clifton Drumfield's commercial warehouses. Every brick, every pane of glass, every planted row of hedgerow, paid for by the dismantling of the very empire that had tried to grind my wife into the ground. There was a deep, satisfying irony in the fact that the same greed aimed at our destruction had ultimately bankrolled our sanctuary. The estate was alive today, with something entirely different from the hushed tension of corporate schemes or the sharp, entitled demands of people who once thought they owned us. We were hosting a small, intimate garden gathering to mark the changing of the season. No caterers performing for high society guests. No gleaming imported sports cars lined up in the circular drive. The people spread across the manicured lawn were the handful of genuine friends built over a lifetime of quiet, mutual loyalty. People who never once cared what title I held or what I drove to work. These were the ones who picked up the phone just to ask how we were holding up when the news of the trial broke across every financial outlet in the city. I caught sight of my attorney Harlan near the outdoor kitchen, a plate of grilled vegetables in hand, laughing with his whole chest at something someone had just said. It was an unexpected pleasure seeing him free of his precise courtroom suits. He had on a simple linen shirt and a pair of easy trousers. He was no longer the legal instrument I had used to surgically remove my son from my holdings. Tonight, he was simply a trusted friend on a warm summer evening. He found my eyes from across the patio and lifted his glass in a quiet, wordless toast. One that said he understood exactly what this moment represented, what it had cost to get here. I raised mine back, a silent acknowledgement of everything he had stood beside me through when the ground beneath my family was giving way. My gaze drifted across the lawn and settled where it always found itself eventually. Evelyn was standing in the shade of a large oak tree encircled by a small cluster of friends. She was radiant. She had on a flowing, elegant dress, the color of soft champagne that gathered the last warmth of the setting sun. Her silver hair lay softly around her shoulders, and her eyes held a joy that was settled and deep and impossible to shake. It had been nearly a year since that dark, rain-soaked afternoon when a woman who mistook money for moral authority shoved her into the mud. Nearly a year since our own blood stood by and let himself laugh at her humiliation. The road back had not been a gentle one. There were long and quiet nights, hollowed out by grief for the son we had lost to his own ambitions. But watching her now, I knew she had come all the way through it. The oppressive shadow cast by our treacherous son and his cruel wife had lifted entirely from her life. She was free. Her laughter drifted across the garden toward me, clear and melodic, a sound I had gone far too long without. For years, we had moved carefully around the escalating needs and unspoken judgments of a son poisoned by his own hunger for status. We had made ourselves smaller, stepped back, faded into the margins of his story. We had absorbed the low-grade disrespect and the quiet manipulations, because we told ourselves that loving a child without condition meant enduring him without limit. We were wrong. Unconditional love is not the same thing as placing yourself on an altar for someone who has chosen to become a predator, even when that predator carries your name. Evelyn had arrived at that truth. So had I. She no longer bore the guilt of a mother who believed she had somehow failed. She had come to understand that we handed our son every instrument he needed to construct something worthy, and he had taken those instruments and forged himself a set of shackles. I drifted away from the main gathering toward the far edge of the stone terrace, where the land sloped gently downward into a valley below. The sky above it was shifting into deep purples shot through with brilliant orange. I turned the aged bourbon in my crystal glass slowly, watching it catch the last of the fading light. The air was completely still. The furious grinding noise of federal investigations, bankruptcy proceedings, and corporate boardroom confrontations felt far away now, a bad dream, already losing its edges. My empire was secure. The holding company was strong, and the wealth I had accumulated across a lifetime was locked inside ironclad blind trusts, earmarked for organizations that had actually earned the right to benefit from it. I drew in a long, slow breath of clean country air. The correction I had set in motion all those months ago had run its full course. I found myself thinking about the nature of a family tree. When a man plants the seeds of his lineage, he brings everything he has to the soil: his hope, his resources, his time. He waters the roots with years of sacrifice and devotion, expecting the branches above to grow strong and climb toward the light. But sometimes the sickness finds its way in underground. A rot takes hold beneath the surface and begins its slow, quiet work, moving up through the trunk, spreading into the branches, poisoning the leaves. If you keep those infected branches connected, out of loyalty you've confused with love, the rot will take everything. It will pull the whole tree down into the earth alongside it and consume what you spent your life building. I had been forced to make the most agonizing decision available to a man. I had to swing a heavy axe into my own family tree. I had to remove the branch that had become my son, cut his toxic roots away from my life before his arrogance and his greed could drag my wife and everything I had built down into total ruin alongside him. It was a brutal severing that left a scar I will carry for the rest of my days. But standing on this quiet patio, watching the last light drop below the horizon, I knew with complete certainty it was the only decision that could have been made. The rot was gone. The infection had been fully excised. I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth of it settle in my chest. I looked back toward the softly glowing patio where Evelyn stood smiling, her hands wrapped around those of the friends who had never left her side. The garden was at peace. The walls of our new home were solid. The dead wood had been burned, and whatever ash remained had been carried off by the wind. What was left could finally grow quietly and without interruption for whatever years remained to us. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Stories like this one don't leave you quickly, and I don't think they're meant to. Looking back on everything Gordon and Evelyn endured, what strikes me most is not the courtroom, not the boardroom, not even the moment Cody's face fell apart when he learned what he had thrown away. What strikes me is the years of quiet they had to rebuild from scratch. The grief of cutting away your own child. The cost of choosing your dignity over your delusion. I believe God does not waste suffering, and what Gordon carried through those months was not wasted. It forged something in him that no amount of inherited wealth could have bought. That is the kind of family justice that courtrooms can confirm, but never create. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. If someone asks you to sign something you do not fully understand, stop. Read it yourself, or have someone you trust read it first. A loving family member will wait. A predator will rush you. Wealth you did not earn through your own discipline is not a foundation. It is a weight. And arrogance will always find a way to make you carry it alone. Do not shrink yourself to make a cruel person comfortable. Not for a child, not for a spouse, not for anyone. Unconditional love has limits, and knowing where those limits are is not failure, it is wisdom. If these revenge stories about family loyalty, family betrayal, and hard-won family justice speak to something in your own life, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me what this one brought up for you. And if you know someone who is quietly holding a weight like the one Gordon carried, someone who needs to hear that they are not wrong for protecting themselves, please share this story with them. It might be exactly what they need today. Subscribe to Silent Sweet Revenge so you never miss what comes next. I'm grateful you were here. Take good care of yourself, and I'll talk to you soon.